Reading through these poems this week and preparing, I thought I needed to make at least a gesture toward an apology that I just need to report to you that I was not in a deep depression when I said it's just that we're about as deep in Lent now as we can be, and the lessons are reflect that. And so I read these poems, and someone said a couple of weeks ago, "Gosh, these are dark. Nice, these are midnight." Oh, well, welcome. Any unfinished business from last week? Anybody itching to comment on a poem this week?
So last week we did the Wendell-Berry, the Wendell-Berry piece. I'm on the Diocesan Creation Care Task Force, and we were talking about midweek. We had our meeting and talking about sending out a newsletter, and subject came up of in May is Bird Migration Day, May 13th. And so, which excited me. And then we were starting to talk about darkness, and being able to, what happens in darkness. And I said, I've got something for the newsletter. I've got this really cool little poem. So it moved beyond this room.
Well, since you're promoting Bird Migration Day, I just have to report that I think it's the 27th of April is Poem in Your Pocket Day. And so I invite you to put a favorite poem in your pocket that day. And did I tell you this? I did. Yeah. You can bring the whole world to a stop without too much trouble.
Even your desk.
Even my desk.
Well, they did it with PT too.
Well, that was interesting. Yeah, I'll just say that the COVID shutdown treated me well. I gave me the opportunity to have both knees replaced, and so I spent a good deal of time in PT. And Poem in Your Pocket Day came to pass during one of those series of treatments, and so it was the E. Cummings poem that we shared a couple of weeks ago, last week. And so I had that little card, and I got up and they got me up on the table and was about to start manipulating my leg. And I said, wait a minute. I said, this is Poem in Your Pocket Day. And I had printed, I think, 9 or 10 copies of that and just tucked them in my pocket for the day. And I said, here to my therapist, who is a good guy. And I told him it was Poem in the Pocket Day. And I said, just would like to read this poem to you, which I really enjoyed. And the people on either side, there were therapists and patients on either side, and they started to listen and they wanted to be part of it. And so they gathered around, and then some other people gathered around. I gave up all my cards, 9 or 10 of them, but I looked and I had the sense that people were starving for poetry, just the language of it and the imagination. I mean, who would think that? Well, I mean, but these are your typical young physical therapists and their patients, but the therapists were interested, which interested me. And the word got out. Another guy came to me a week later and said, hey, I saw one of those cards. You got more? But these are the young, fit, these are the guys women who go out and hike 40 miles over the weekend and all of that, and all that. And they just seemed to want to do poetry, which was astounding to me. Also, you're right, I got out of physical therapy.
Interesting was how many months later you come back and your therapist took you into the office.
Yes, he did, and he,
Said he wanted to show you something.
yeah, he had,
And Jim thought maybe it was a picture of a new baby or something, and he posted this poem. Saying.
well, anybody want to start on the poem this time?
I can, with an apology, because I meant to bring something to show and tell and I forgot. So maybe I'll bring it next week.
Please.
But it was my response to Skid Row by Madeline Decrease. Out of the depths have I cried, O Lord, where the lean heart preys on the hardened crust, where short wicks falter on candle hopes, and winter whips at a patchwork front. From darkened doorways, no welcome shines, no promise waits up the broken stair. And the coin that summons the night with wine buys a morning of sick despair. Out of the depths have I cried in vain, and the still streets echo my lonely calls. All the long night in the moaning wind, the bruised reed breaks and sparrow falls. Some many years ago, and I can't even begin to tell you how many. I was manning a booth at our diocesan convention for a nonprofit that helps survivors of child abuse and trauma. And just down the road from our table was another table. I don't have no idea whose table it was, but somebody had gotten a brilliant idea of giving homeless people disposable cameras. And they documented their reality, and they matted the pictures and sold them.
Mhm.
And there was a picture, I walked by and went, I need that, you know, and I was in the middle of doing a whole ton of spiritual healing myself. And it really spoke to me, but it's the opposite of this. It's a picture of light coming in through bars. Everything else is dark. It's really hard to describe. I will read it next to me. I read this, but wait. And so it struck me that poetry is formed in different ways, not always with words.
Hmm.
So.
Would be, I can see a little card coming from you. This poem on one side and your photograph on the other.
Yeah,
That would be neat.
yeah,
Sounds though they would be antiphonal, not agreeing,
Right.
not once reinforcing the other, but sort of the opposite side.
mhm, mhm.
Yeah, bring it, please. Yeah. Well, this is about as low as it gets. I selected that poem among other reasons, but primarily because it is a kind of oppositional and antiphonal riff on Psalm 130. It quotes it to begin,
Mhm.
but Psalm 130, which I will read because well, to discuss a poem, it should be read, but also this is just a marvelous poem. Out of the depths have I called to you, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears consider well the voice of my supplication. If you, Lord, were to note what is done amiss, O Lord, who could stand? For there is forgiveness with you, therefore you shall be feared. I wait for the Lord, my soul waits for him. In his word is my hope. My soul waits for the Lord. More than watchmen for the morning, more than watchmen for the morning. O Israel, wait for the Lord. For with the Lord there is mercy. With him there is plenteous redemption. And he shall redeem Israel from all their sins. I'll begin at the bottom and work up, but obviously Skid Row ends in an entirely different place than the 131st Psalm. the psalm ends with plenteous redemption. And Skid Row ends with two quotes from Matthew, or paraphrases, or at least references to Matthew. The first is, a bruised reed shall he not break, but in this poem, the reed breaks. And a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without the Father's leave, and here the sparrow falls. So this is a pretty hopeless poem. And I think is a wonderful poem for me because it gives me a window into the hopelessness of this speaker's soul. As I've said earlier, we can't necessarily think that the poet is speaking for herself in this case, but she's created at least a speaker. And this has, well, people who've been in pastoral ministry and people like who tell this story walking through their doors all the time. And it's a very painful place.
It almost seems like it's coming from someone who's in a very deep depression.
Well, at least a deep depression. And quoting the 131st Psalm, out of the depths have I cried, O Lord. The poem begins with kind of positioning the speaker in the depths of despair. I'm sorry. It is 130, yeah, the 130. Actually, the 131st Psalm is another psalm. No. I've spent some time with the 131st Psalm too, I'm sorry. The 130. I'll just talk about the psalm at the top of the page. But I really liked the 130th Psalm. You begin to read it and you begin to think it's an individual lament, you know. I have cried to you, O Lord, but by the time you get to the end, it's, O Israel, wait for the Lord. And so as the psalm unfolds, I then have to go back and read and say, is the despair, the hopelessness that the psalmist feels his own? You know, is this like a person who's trapped in the cycle of poverty and dereliction and addiction and so on? Or is he in despair because the community is in despair? I conclude on reading this, but there are a lot of different readings that he actually, I rather like this because I think it's the community that is in trouble. And he is crying out on behalf of the community. And what I like about the psalm is he's not praying for them. He's praying for us. He is praying for the community, with the community. So he has located himself in the community, but we don't know what the misbehavior is. We only know that things have been done amiss, and he appeals to the Lord saying, knowing what has gone, what we have done amiss, who could possibly stand? But then appeals to the Lord on the basis that in the Lord there is forgiveness. But then it's this next section that I just love, and it's so characteristic of Hebrew poetry. Just look at the repetitions. I wait for the Lord, my soul waits for him. Wait appears twice. In his word is my hope, my soul waits for the Lord. Third time, as you read through these lines, the sense gets more and more intense. And then he uses a simile, more than watchmen for the morning, and intensifies that yet again by repeating it. More than watchmen for the morning. So, well, that leaves me wondering, what does he mean by wait? If I am in a similar situation, do I simply crack a beer and sit in my easy chair and wait? or the image that came to mind, I think of watchmen on the rampart of the city, and the hard part is at night because you can't see the enemy approaching. So you really are waiting for the dawn. But while you're waiting, you're looking very attentive. And the image that came to mind was the mother who was watching with a sick child, who was just, it's not a passive sitting and saying, oh, I'll just sit up here and the kid will sleep and I'll sleep well. No, she's looking at him. She's looking for every sign, every change, she's done all she can do. Beyond that, she's helpless. So her waiting is attentive, caring, it's praying, and it's just paying attention.
Well, and I think yearning, I mean, how many times the doctor said if they can make it through the night, we'll be okay, kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think there's a yearning, if we can keep the castle safe tonight.
Yep.
Maybe reinforcements are coming in morning.
Yeah, my grandmother talked about the crisis. That's when the fever broke and you knew the kid was going to live.
So I was going to say 2 comments. I didn't want to interrupt.
No,
wait
please.
Of course, I had preached today. So when you preach, you look at the lessons in advance, and you may look at a commentary or someone.
One looks at this.
So I'm not preaching. I mentioned the psalm in the sermon, but 2 things. One is that this is a psalm of ascent. It's one of the psalms of ascent. It's one of the psalms that pilgrims would say as they were going up to Jerusalem.
You're right. I correct.
And so but it's included in, I was glad when they said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. That's Psalm 122, a psalm of ascent, and then you get this other one, out of the depths I cry. So what does the pilgrim say when the pilgrim's going up? Is there just one thing that's all joy, or is there this other sort of thing that says, I've got this other stuff that's going on with me that I've got to carry up to the temple with me? So I was sort of struck by that. But the other thing that came out as I was doing some commentary work is that morning was understood as the time of revelation. And there's another psalm that talks about that as well. And then I was thinking about that other great piece of scripture, the Lord of the Rings. And there's a point which Gandalf rides off and he says, look for me on the morning of the 3rd day. Look for my coming on the morning of the 3rd day, and they're in this castle, and they're getting creamed, and then all of a sudden the light dawns, and they're up at the top of the hill with this huge army. It's Gandalf, So I mean, there's the watchman for the morning, waiting more than for the watchman. That occurred to me. That image just sort of struck me when I was reading this, but also sort of amplified by that sense that morning was the time of seen as the time of revelation.
Maybe Tolkien was inspired by his close friend C.S. Lewis.
Oh, I'm sure. Tolkien was a pretty brilliant guy.
Yeah, thank you. I had not paid attention to the fact that this was one of the songs of sin. Yeah, that helps.
Well, it just is another way of looking at it, as in that regard. And not surprisingly, it's one of the church's writ large 7 penitential songs. So, obviously, we got a lot more going for it than some of the other songs.
I had a slightly different,
Please.
and that's one of the things about poetry is that read it differently. For me, the subtext of the poem or the songs was death. I don't know why that struck me that way. But the metaphor of the watchman waiting for morning, from my own experience being on watch, when the morning comes, then you're off watch. So then your duty is done, you go on to the next thing. So this would be going, into the afterlife.
Huh.
It's kind of how it struck me.
Permit me just one more comment on this. Assuming that this is a kind of communal lament, that the speaker of the psalm, which is a poem, so is speaking from within the heart and the experience of the community. I couldn't help thinking that whether we today are liberals or conservatives, and today, unfortunately, you're either one or the other. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot going on in the middle of the country right now. One thing we can agree on is that we are deeply concerned about, our culture. We may have when we articulate those concerns, they may be different, but in any event, we're concerned. I have a brother-in-law who is entirely on the other end of the continuum than I am. And someday when we have time, I'll tell you some horror stories about family dynamics. And how I've almost ruined ours. But one thing that I've discovered is that we're both deeply concerned. We may read the data differently. We clearly listen to different news outlets. But when you live in so something is amiss is where I'm going with this. And what do you do when something's amiss? I think about this a lot now. I'm retired. I live at Wingcrest. At least when I was employed in the church, I had standing in an institution to speak. But I don't have standing now. I'm just there. What do you do? How can you make a difference? We have conversations with people and say, we're just one person. What difference can a person make? Well, I began to think of the watchman in the morning, not watching passively, but attentively, and with all the concern that the mother of the sick child watches with, or the man on watch. I just wonder, as I don't sleep at night, I want to think that through and noodle that. I think at least attentively watching, paying attention, doing what the mother would do as the child gives indication that she is doing better, doing worse, at least caring in an attentive, active way is an option. Well, I'm done. Anybody else?
George Herbert. Just well, I wasn't gonna really make a whole lot, I'll read it, but I wasn't gonna make a whole lot of comment on Paul, other than the brilliance of the construction. Just I'll come back to that in a second. My words and thoughts do both express this notion that life hath with the sun a double motion. The first is straight, and our diurnal friend, the other hid, and doth obliquely bend. One life is wrapped in flesh and tends to earth. The other winds towards him whose happy birth taught me to live here, so that still one eye should aim and shoot at that which is on high. Quitting with daily labor all my pleasure, to gain at harvest an eternal treasure. Again, my thoughts, anybody else can speak to this certainly, but my thoughts on this were just the construction. And one of the things going back to the Psalms is that there are a lot of Psalms that are acrostics. That in Hebrew, the first verse begins with Aleph, the second verse begins with Bet, the third verse begins with Gimel. We don't see that in the translation, and so we miss the artistry, that artistry of the poet there. And so it's nice to see that kind of artistry here in the way of those words diagonally across the page. There was a church in Berkeley called Good Shepherd. And I was, when I was campus minister at UC Berkeley, there were 5 congregations that were the significant contributors to the mission and ministry of Canterbury House. And so as the executive director, and I was in all of those congregations all the time, doing the rounds. And there was a fellow at this little church, teeny little church, Good Shepherd, who was a poet. And he would go through and retranslate these acrostic songs so that they were an acrostic in English. So you could see it in English. It's the only place I've ever seen that.
Did you add the italics, or was that the poets?
No, those are the poets.
Yeah, because my life was hidden in that goes with the title.
Pardon?
Well, it is.
Yeah, it's almost the title.
And it's a quote from Colossians, or a paraphrase anyway. Yeah, well, that's characteristic of the metaphysical poets, John Donne, Henry Vaughan, and George Herbert, I guess, were the 3 big boys in that movement. And they loved wordplay, and they, the more time you spend with one of their poems, the more tricks you see they're playing on you. For example, you may not want to go into this poem, but I do.
That's fine, that's fine.
For example, the metaphor, if that's the right word, is this double motion, which is he's playing with the spirit flesh duality that runs through so much of Christian thought, which is why the Emily Dickinson is right above it. They're there because of the Romans lesson this morning. So, but he's playing with that dualism, and so the sun has a double motion. The first is it rises in the east and goes down in the west. That's the diurnal, straightforward one. Then there's a hidden one which doth obliquely bend, and that is as the seasons change, the sun is closer to the horizon or higher in the sky. So he is tapping into that. So one is hid and doth obliquely bend, because just in the course of the day, I'm not aware of the sun in its relationship to the horizon.
Or its altitude. Because the Anamine is an infinity. So if you take a photograph.
What he said.
It's really neat. Infinity, the sun.
Oh,
And the
okay.
Anamine, if you take a picture of the sun at noon every day, then, and like on a tripod, so you can change it, it's better as. Then position creates infinities.
Well, I am glad you're here. That just gives such, I don't know whether,
And infinity is very spiritual.
yeah, well, I don't know whether, did astronomy know that in the 1600s?
Babylonians do it 3,000.
Okay, so maybe,
Maybe 1600s.
Herbert may well have. I'm certainly knew that it, rose and fell in relation to the horizon. But that's just that makes it so much richer for me.
Perhaps, like I was saying, because it could be horizontal too. The sun rises and sets in different positions,
Yeah.
and the solstice, which then began Christmas, when, that all came together, was the standing part of the sun. The sun rises more and more in the south, shorter days,
Mhm.
and then on the 23rd of December, it starts moving back, but you don't notice it until the 25th.
Hmm.
And that's why Stonehenge is all organized. It's lining up.
Nancy wrote a paper on Stonehenge when she was in her master's program, so you better check.
Long time ago.
Well, that's interesting, and I would not be surprised if not specifically aware of that, somehow intuitively aware of that, because these metaphysical poets mess with our minds. And I'm going to go on to talk about again, this double motion. One life is wrapped in flesh. So he's now taken the kind of astronomical image and he's now applying it to us. So the straightforward line is our bodily line, birth to death, and it tends to earth. The other winds toward him, whose happy birth will go on from there, but winds toward him. I don't know if I'm pushing this too far or not. Wind can also be read wind. And Herbert was a scholar of Greek and Latin, was the university orator. So he was facile in those languages and would have known and would, I think, have assumed that his readers would know that the word for wind, breath, and spirit in Greek would be pneuma and in Hebrew ruach. And those three meanings held together. And I can't help but think that he's doing a wordplay here, that one winds toward him, that makes its way, as we wind our way down the aisle at Walmart. But the word,
Some people winding.
but the word is also wind. And it is the spiritual trajectory that he's talking about here. So these metaphysical poets, I think, are having a lot of fun with us. Now the different.
Get this strange image of Herbert sitting this. That's great.
Well, that's interesting because I had the same thought, except that mine was a little more prideful. I was thinking of Herbert sitting there writing and saying, man, am I good? That's a good one. The other, the interesting comparison between this and the Emily Dickinson is, and just quickly to read Emily Dickinson, death is a dialogue between the spirit and the dust. Dissolve, says death. The spirit, sir, I have another trust, another destiny, another purpose. Death doubts it, argues from the ground. The spirit turns away, just laying off for evidence an overcoat of clay, which is sort of a lovely, lighthearted, you can have this, I'm going on. Made me think of that. You remember back probably 15, 20 years ago in the NFL, they wore tearaway jerseys so that if a defense player wanted to tackle someone, he could grab the shirt and pull him down, but now their jerseys tore away. And I have this feeling that death is in that situation. You know, he's grabbed the spirit, but the spirit tears away. And so all death is left with is a fistful of clay. And the spirit makes the touchdown. The difference between the Emily Dickinson poem and the Herbert poem is that Emily Dickinson only wants to reflect on what I suppose we could say is the eternal life of the soul and the inconsequential life of the flesh. Herbert deals with that same duality, but then has a didactic end to the poem. Because the other winds toward him, capital H, so we're assuming that is Christ, whose happy birth taught me to live here so that still one eye should aim to shoot at that which is on high. So Herbert acknowledges the spirit flesh dualism, but then wants to ask the question, so what is the implication of that for how I live from dawn to dusk? You know, when I'm washing dishes, when I'm doing whatever I do.
I love this next one, this brim area is that one. I think that one's really good.
Please.
Lord, I know my days are numbered. There are not many of them left. Enough for me to gather the sand with which they will cover my face. I will not have enough time to render justice to the injured or ask forgiveness of all those who suffered evil at my hands. That is why my soul is grieved. My life should come full circle, closed like a well-built sonata. But now I see clearly just before the coda, the broken chords, badly set colors and words, the din of dissonance, the tongues of chaos. Why was my life not like circles on the water, welling from infinite depths, like an origin which grows, falls into layers, rungs, folds, to expire serenely in your inscrutable lap? That's somebody who is near the end of their life and has quite a few regrets about the way that they lived. At least that's that's what I take from it.
Right. At Windcrest, you hear a lot of
Of this,
yeah, you do. Well, I mean, there's a kind of a morbid humor that we all share. We talk about, you know, something that's going to happen in the future, or just down the hall, there's a great guy who's, how old is Ross? 93 or something. Anyway, he was in conversation with his doctor, and the doctor said, you know, we could do this procedure or not this procedure, something. Have I talked about this before? And Ross said, do the procedure. I don't have that much time left. So we sort of have this morbid humor going around. Yeah, our days are numbered. I love this poem. And yeah. Oh, it hurts, doesn't it? That second stanza, I just don't, I don't know about you, but I lie awake at night, and I think of all the dumb things I've done in my life, and I can never repair them. You know, this second stanza just tears my, I mean, it's as though somebody just reached into my chest and pulled my heart out.
I thought that about the third one too.
Well, there's just a profound sadness here, isn't there? You know, I really wanted my life to come together and be tidy like a nice sonata, and all of a sudden I hear dissonance and harmonies are broken and. Yeah. And I don't know if you noticed, to expire serenely in your inscrutable lap. Do you remember the poem for the tomcat who folded at the, when the tomcat was no longer going out and killing birds and fish and so on, folded quietly into his mistress's lap. Just a similar image. No meaning to it, I just noticed it. The other thing I noticed about this, and I've been in correspondence with a friend in Columbus about this, and I think he thinks I'm an infidel or something. But the poets seem not to be frightened to say that God is beyond our comprehension, that God can be terrifying, that God is just sheer being itself. In so many of the poems, I'm almost tempted to go and get a highlighter and just in every poem, this sense of your inscrutable laugh. Hear the poet, and if you can pronounce Zbigniew's first name, I will learn from you. I have no idea how you pronounce that. Polish poet. I don't know too much about him. Went online. Found out that he was active in the Polish resistance against the Nazi invasion. And most of his poetry was political and activist. So this is Celeste, come in, we miss you.
I got some good seating. You know, good seating. I hated about it.
There's a seat right there. Yeah, once we get you in here, we're not letting you go until 10 after.
Well, you mentioned that. I think that kind of gives some context to this, about him being part of the Polish resistance to the Nazis. And I think that gives some context to maybe how the time that he wrote this in.
Okay. I just want to say.
Maybe he felt like they were closing in on him.
I just want to say that there is a school of reading poetry, I think, that says if you know a lot about the poet and what the poet's life setting was, that's a key to the poetry. I think that enriches the poetry, but I think a piece of art stands on its own. And you don't need to know, I don't need, and I can never know who the author of Psalm 130 was, but boy, that psalm nails me. And I think the same is true of the visual arts. People take masters and PhDs in art history and know all kinds of things, which will enrich that person's view of a piece of art, but it does nothing to a kid who walks into a gallery and is absolutely stunned by a piece of art the first time he looks at it. I think these poems stand on their own.
You can see something with your head, and then you can see something with your heart.
Yeah.
You can see something with your gut.
Yeah,
And it will be different each time.
yeah,
Sometimes they go together.
yeah. Well, I was going to say, when you go together, it's been a very good day and a dangerous one. If you remember that quote on from Sister Mary, whatever her name was, on the front piece on the first week, when she's talking about prayer, she says it can be dangerous. And I think reading poetry can be dangerous in a sense, because it invites you to take life on without all our filters, but to look at it face to face.
In some ways, this poem sort of reminds me of, oh God, when you say like, what's with the avocado being so big? you know, and like, how come you made my life messy, God? Why couldn't it have just been a nice little circle and neat, nice, neat and tidy and like, really, screw it up again, you know?
I think that's there. The way I read the sense of this, that his feeling is more of grief and loss and not of, not the kind of Job saying, hey, I challenge you because my life hasn't turned out. I've been a good guy. I haven't done anything bad. And still things have turned out in an unfortunate way. And Job would sort of, I think, want to take God on and shake his fist.
Yeah, I don't hear that, but
But there is, yeah,
what the heck?
I know, yeah. Yeah. I just want to say one thing, not to bring the conversation to a close, but I do want to say, I thought about this during the week, that we read these poems, and the question is, why are we reading poems in church on Lent, during Lent? I see these poems and I read them almost as though they were scripture. I'm not suggesting that they have the authority of scripture, but they are windows into my own soul. They're windows into the infinite. And I think that is, for me, that is where, you know, the spiritual equation takes place. And so oftentimes, I wonder if you walk away saying, well, that wasn't much more than a seventh grade English class. And you know, I hope for you these poems are something more than that, that they invite you to a kind of a reflection of and just an opportunity to see your life through from a perspective that you might not have had prior to reading the poem.
I have to admit that I was inspired last time that I came, and so I actually wrote a poem, and it's being read out in Western Australia this week because I was inspired. It made me think more. I usually think a lot anyway, but I actually went through a whole lot of things, and then I came up with this poem, and I thought, oh my goodness, and then I realized that there's a biblical context, because I work for a secular group who are not religious, but they might be privately. And I just was inspired. And so in that same week after I came, I wrote the poem, and it's gone to Western Australia.
Well, and you shared a poem at the very end that you had written.
That was just little things.
Well,
My other poem I've got right here.
well, what I wanted to ask, and this, and if this is improper, just slap me down. But I was going to ask whether you would be willing to share what you had written with us. Could you type it up and
Well, yeah, I've actually got that poem I just wrote right here.
Okay.
I can read it if you want. I
Okay.
don't hog everything. That's why I'm just holding back at all times, because I could talk for 3 hours on poetry and the spirit.
We only have 4.5 minutes.
My activity. So I don't want to, but I can read it out.
Okay.
Yeah, if you want me to, this is I was inspired, and so it's very simple, but it's the poetic stance is a 3-foot quatrain with the couplet, so it could be seen as that's what you're looking at with the 10-syllable line. So that's the technical stuff. And it's very simple to understand, but I actually got inspired at the end. I thought, oh, what have I just written? Hell, let me look, it's Exodus. So I'll see what's in by now. And it's very simple. It's called Clear the Way. One must do what one must before one's done. Sing, smile, laugh out loud, share one's energy, give with all one's heart, and the race is run. Breathe, follow the flow in order to be. Spring's soft enticement sets one out to roam, and summer's prophet call is strong and clear. Then autumn's cool winds gently call us home, and winter's white cloak draws us ever near. So much wisdom, so much in each season. Humanity must surely feel and see the joy in all, the answer, the reason. But first the boil must break to set one free. This source of distress, of conflict, of strife, must burst, must allow healing, then new life. So that was my inspiration after all.
No, thank you. Thank you. Would you be willing to make copies of that available to us?
Yes, it's got my poet's name at the end, so I'm Celeste Blundell Camden as the poet, because that's how I'm published as. But Carmen is my surname, you know. But yeah, I don't mind, it just means photocopying, whatever.
Yeah, I think you could just put that with the rest of the poems.
Oh,
Yeah,
oh, we just, okay.
thank you.
Well, I'll see somebody about photocopying, whatever. Did you want photocopies in the times or?
Copy him and all these things got printed. So.
I know how to use the copier. I have the code.
So.
Yeah,
See,
thank you.
I just wasn't inspired. I get it very inspired by certain things and I have to write. So that's the poet thing. I have to write.
And I have to read, so. Just a housekeeping matter, next week's folder has 2 sheets, so there are 8 pages instead of 4. And we obviously won't have a chance to talk about them all. But I just felt that ending on Good Friday was kind of a bummer, so I had to put some Easter poems in there as well. So, well, we have maybe 2 minutes or something. Is there anything else? Someone? I just want to put a word in here for Wilfred Owen. I don't know why, but I'm deeply drawn to him, and I think there may be another Wilfred Owen showing up next week. I'm not quite sure, but the cry of a young man sent to war. It just tears my heart out. And
You read that while you're listening to Benjamin Britten.
well, I was going to say, I forget. Forget what the occasion was, but at the cathedral in Cleveland, there was a quickly pulled together performance of the War Requiem because of something that happened in the world. I can't remember, but the place was jammed, and I mean, it was like being at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. There, the tears were just pouring down. It was one of the powerful moments of my experience. Well, for a lot of sadness. This Andalusian exile. I don't know anything about Ahmad Shaki other than what I've looked up. He was Egyptian and exiled to Spain by the Brits, and wrote this poem presumably when he was in exile. And had to put that in. Like the Wilfred Owen, it keys against the Ezekiel lesson this morning, the dry bones, and just there are many to heal the body. I'm at the last couplet. If there are many to heal the body if we but seek them, which is interesting. If we but seek them, but where? Or where the skillful healer of the soul. Well, I think we better go get ready for worship, eh?
We leave from one church to another church. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There's one more session.
There's one more session
Mm,
next week, yeah.
very much.
Thank you all for your willingness to share and both read the poems and share your, I even forget the technical term, but I'm just fascinated. The Andalima, is that the name of the infinity?